Earlier in the show, we talked about the impact the Mississippi River's closure for certain ports impacts us here in Louisiana. Joining us now for this week's Bottom Line is Neil Melancon. Neil, it's interesting how a drought in the Midwest can really affect the ports and elevators here in Louisiana. What's that going to mean for us on a national and global scale?
Well, Avery, to get a handle on the way this impacts the rest of the world, it's important to understand the role Louisiana grain impacts the national markets. Our state has an advantage in that we can generally plant early and thus harvest grain earlier than anyone else. On top of that, we have the Mississippi River right there, so there's not as much cost to ship grain to overseas destinations as they do further along the Mississippi River, like in the Midwest. And that shipping is the key to understanding the role the U.S. plays. We are the #1 exporter of grains in the world, so when that export capacity is impacted, it hits home all over. Right now, we have a drought that is going to severely impact grain production in the U.S., so not only do we have an advantage in that we get our grain out early in Louisiana, but we now have the advantage of having an abundance of it at a time when there's likely going to be a massive shortfall. All of which points to a very profitable time for farmers, right? Well, hopefully so, but there's some big roadblocks in the way. First off, closures along the river for grain facilities means that we have fewer ways to get our grain out. That advantage of being close to the river starts to get curtailed when our farmers and more inland grain elevators have to go further to drop off grain. The more they do so, the more that's going to cut into their profitability. Second, even when you can find an open port, there's much less traffic allowed right now on the Mississippi, which means fewer barges available for transporting grain, also cutting into the amount the farmer gets paid. Finally, when farmers in the Midwest are met with conditions like this, they simply store their grain for better times. We don't have that kind of storage capacity here in Louisiana, which means most of the grain now has to be shipped. The bottom line is, while there's certainly a demand for our grain, getting it there is a big part of the battle. So Avery, when places like Bungie and Lake Providence are shut down, it's a link in a chain that leads to some big headaches for grain producers here in Louisiana.
And that all trickles down to the rest of the economy, and that's really the big concern. Thank you very much, Neil Melancon. And remember, you can listen to Neil's daily radio reports on the Louisiana Farm Bureau Agri-News Radio Network. For a list of stations where you can tune in or to listen online, click over to our website, twilatv.org, and click on the radio link on the left side of the homepage. Well, that does it for this edition of This Week in Louisiana Agriculture. Be sure to join us next week when we'll show you how one of the areas hardest hit by the flood of 2011 is coming back 1 year later. Until then, you can watch any of our stories online. Just click over to our website at twilatv.org. For all of us here and the Twila team, thank you for joining us. Hope to see you right here next week.